Hello, and welcome to this live read of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. Today we'll be reading chapters 19 and 20 of the book. So let's begin. Chapter 19, The Boniface Estate. Mrs. Frisby said, "Jonathan and Mr. H's got the screen open." "Yes," said Nicodemus, "and without them I doubt that we could have done it. The steel frame was strong, the bolt was secure, and the wire so stiff we could not have bent it enough for one of us to go through. So we were glad that they were with us, and asked them if they would, after all, like to stay with us. Since there were only two of them, they said they would, for the time being at least. And now began a journey that was to last, with some interruptions, for almost 2 years. Parts of it were pleasant. It was a joyful feeling at first just to be free again and to get those laboratory collars off, and parts of it were terrible. I have made notes about all of it, and it was if the time ever comes when rats publish books of their own, I intend to write a book about it. It would be a long book, full of trouble and danger, too much to tell now. It was in one of the dangerous times that I lost my eye and got the scar that you see on my face. But we did have some happy times, and some pieces of great good luck, two in particular, that helped to explain how we got here and what our plans are now. It was early summer when we got out. We had known that beforehand. We could tell by the lateness of the light through the windows, though it was dark when we finally stood on the roof. We had no trouble getting down the side of the building, however. There were downspouts to the corners, with plenty of toe holes. We dropped the screwdriver and the spool of thread into one of these. A little lower there was ivy, and we were all good climbers, and there was moonlight to go and see by. In less than 15 minutes we were on the ground. Staying in the darkest shadows under the bushes, we sped away from Nimh, not knowing or caring at first what direction we were going. Nobody saw us. During the next few weeks we lived as we could. We had, in a way, to learn all over again how to get along, for although the world outside the laboratory was the same, we ourselves were different. We were, a couple of times, reduced to eating from dumps and garbage cans, but knowing how to read, we quickly learned to recognize signs on buildings, groceries, supermarket, meats and vegetables, for instance, to let us know that there was food inside for the taking. And once inside the supermarket at night, they always leave a few lights on, we could even read the signs on the wall, directing us to Section 8 for dairy products, Section 3 for baked goods, so on. In the country, there were barns and silos stocked with grain and corn, and chicken houses full of eggs. Occasionally we came upon other rats, and a few times we talked to them, but not for long, because after a few words, they would begin to look at us strangely and edge away. Somehow they could tell that we were different. I think we even looked different. Either the diet or the injections at Nimh had made us bigger and stronger than other rats, and all the strange rats we saw looked to us surprisingly weak and puny. So we were set apart from even our own kind. It was while we were in the country that we had our first important stroke of luck. We had just about decided, after nearly 4 months of freedom and constant roving, to find a place to settle down, if not permanently, at least for the winter. We thought that it should be in the country, but not too far from a town, so that we would have access to grocery stores as well as barns and gardens. It was about this time, too, that I began to wonder and worry somewhat about the fact that whatever we are, whatever we needed, it must always be stolen. Rats had always lived that way, and yet, why? I talked to some of the others about this. It was the beginning of a discontent and an idea that kept growing, although slowly. The season was autumn. We were walking one evening down a winding country road. We never walked really on the road, but along the edge, so that we could vanish into the bushes or a ditch if anyone came along. You can imagine the 20 rats and 2 mice traveling in precision, when they would cause some comment. We didn't want that. As we walked, we reached a very high fence of wrought iron, the kind that looks like a row of black iron spears fastened together with pointed tops. An expensive fence surrounding a large estate with a big, expensive house in the middle, and well-kept grounds and gardens. We walked along past the fence until we reached a gate. "There's nobody living in there," said Justin. "How do you know?" "Well, the gate's padlocked, and look, dead weeds standing outside of it, not even bent. Nobody's driven in there for a while." The house had a quiet, deserted look. There was a mailbox in front, hanging open empty. "I wonder if we could get in," Jenner said. "Well, why would we?" "It's a big place. It would have a big pantry, a big cupboard, a big freezer, if it's as empty as it looks." We turned into the grounds, moving cautiously, and from beneath some bushes we watched the windows. As dusk fell, lights came on in several of them, both upstairs and down. "Now, that's supposed to make us think that someone's there," Justin said. But there isn't. I could see one of the lamps when it came on. There was nobody near it. They all came on at the same time. Automatic switches to keep burglars away." "Well, they're not keeping me away," said Justin. He ran into the house, climbed to one of the windowsills, and looked in. He tried another, and then he came back. "Nobody," he said. So we went in. We found a small window in the back with a cracked pane, knocked out one corner of the glass, and climbed through. At first we planned just to look for food. We found it, too. Enough to last us for a year or more. As Jenner had predicted, there was a big freezer, well stocked with bread, meat, vegetables, everything, and a whole room full of shelves covered with canned food. The cans baffled us at first, as they had in the grocery stores. We could read what was in them, but we couldn't get it out. And then Arthur found a machine on the kitchen counter. He read the instructions on the side of it. Slide can under cutter and press switch. We tried it. The can turned slowly around in the machine, and when we pulled it out, the top had been cut free. I'll always remember what was in that first can. Clam chowder. Delicious. After we had eaten, we wandered around the house. It was a rich man's mansion, with beautiful furniture and fine rugs and carpeting on the floor. There was a crystal chandelier in the dining room, and a big stone fireplace in the living room. But the greatest treasure of all, for us, was in the study. This was a large rectangular room with walnut paneling, a desk, chairs, and walls lined to the ceiling with books. Thousands of books, about every subject you could think of. There were shelves of paperbacks, there were encyclopedias, histories, novels, philosophies, textbooks of physics, chemistry, electrical engineering, and others, more than I can name. Luckily, there was even one of those small ladders on wheels that they use in some libraries to get us to the top shelves. Well, we fell on those books with even more appetite than on the food, and in the end we moved into the house and stayed all winter. We could do that, it turned out, without much fear of discovery. We learned from some newspaper cutting I found on a desk in the study. They were about a wedding, and most of them showed pictures of a newly married couple leaving a house to begin their honeymoon. The groom was a Mr. Gordon Boniface, heir to the gold Stetson fortune, and the house they were leaving was the house that we were in. According to the clippings, they were going on a trip all the way around the world. They were coming back to the Boniface estate in May. Until then, it was our estate. Oh, there was a caretaker, a gardener who came 3 times a week, and once in a while he would check the house in a cursory sort of way. But that is, he would unlock the front door, glance around to see if everything looked all right, and then lock it again and leave. But he didn't live there. He lived in a small house down the road, and we were expecting him when he came. We had figured it out. From the way the place was kept up, the lawns mowed, the lawns raked, the garden weeded and watered, there had to be someone working on it. So we posted a watch, saw him coming, and kept watching him all the time that he was there. And we made sure, when he looked in the house, that everything did look all right. This involved a certain amount of work. We had to haul all our empty tin cans and other trash at night into the hidden place in the woods, quite far from the house. We cleaned up after ourselves carefully. We learned to use the water taps and the dusting cloths that we found in the kitchen closet. If the caretaker had looked more closely, he would have seen that the kitchen counters were somewhat shinier than they would have been in an empty house, but he didn't. He never even noticed a small corner of glass missing from the back window. And all winter, far into the night, we read books and we practiced writing. Chapter 20. The Main Hall. There came a knock on Nicodemus's office door. It opened, and Justin and Mr. Ages entered. "Ah, back so soon?" said Nicodemus. "Soon?" said Justin. "It's past noon. It's lunchtime." "Past noon?" Mrs. Frisby stood up, remembering her children waiting at home. Down in the rat's home, in the artificial light, it was hard to tell the passage of time. She had been so engrossed in Nicodemus's story that she hadn't even glanced at the clock. Justin was wearing a satchel like Nicodemus's, and from it he took a small paper package. "Here's Dragon's medicine," he said, putting it on the table. He asked Mrs. Frisby, "Did he tell you about the toy tinker?" Nicodemus said, No, I was just coming to that." "Oh, but I can't stay to hear it now," said Mrs. Frisby. "My children will be waiting for their lunch." A plan was worked out. Mrs. Frisby would go home to take care of her children. Nicodemus, Justin, Arthur, and the other rats involved would work out the details of moving her house, which would be done at about 11 o'clock. "After the Fitzgibbons are all asleep, and we're sure the dragon is too," said Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby would return in mid-afternoon to the rose bush. Mr. Ages says, "And I'm going to lie down. After making that trip with this cast, I'm quite tired." "You can have your choice of rooms," said Nicodemus. "Now that Jenner and his friends are gone, we have 7 empty." "Ah, thank you," said Mr. Ages. "Mrs. Frisby, when you return, I will tell you as well as I can exactly how to put the powder in Dragon's food." As she hurried home, Mrs. Frisby considered just how much she should tell her children about all that happened, and all that was going to happen. She decided at that stage at least that she would not tell them about their father's connection with the rats, although that she would not say she had volunteered to put the sleeping powder in Dragon's bowl. That would worry them. She could tell them perhaps when it was safely done, when among other things there would be no chance for Martin to volunteer in her place. She would tell them simply that as the owl had suggested, she had gone to the rats and asked for help. She had found them friendly and intelligent, and a group of them were coming that night to move the house to a place where it would be safe from the plow. That would be enough. She could tell them the whole story later, when she knew it all herself. But it was not enough. The children were skeptical at first, then intensely curious, especially Timothy, who was looking stronger and feeling more energetic, but still staying in bed, primarily because Teresa and Martin had made him. "But why should the rats do that?" said Timothy. "We don't know them at all. Nobody does. They keep to themselves." "Well, maybe it's because the owl sent me," said Mrs. Frisby, searching for an answer that would satisfy him. "They seem to be impressed by the owl." "Well, for that matter," said Timothy, "I don't even see why the owl want to help. He's no friend to ours either." "Maybe they thought someday we could do them a favor in return." "Oh, Mother," said Cynthia, "how could we ever do them a favor?" "You forget. I did do Jeremy a favor. That's what started the whole thing." "Well, that and my getting me sick," said Timothy. "I wish I could get up. I'm tired of bed." "Not yet," said Mrs. Frisby, glad to change the subject. "You must save your strength, because tonight you will have to get up for a little while, and when they move the house, we must be sure that you are well wrapped up, and we hope the night is warm." "It will be," said Martin. "It's turned quite hot outside." Then they ate lunch. That afternoon, Mrs. Frisby told the children that she must leave them to confer again with the rats about moving the house. When she thought of the danger that she would face in just a few more hours, she wanted to kiss them all goodbye, but knowing that Timothy at least was always suspicious, she didn't dare. She told them only that they should not worry if she was at least a little late getting home for supper. On her way back to the rose bush, she felt quite relieved, almost cheerful. Her problems were nearly solved, and the final solution was in sight. If all went well, Timothy would be saved. If all went well. Then the thought of what she had to do came back to her like the clanging of an alarm bell. What worried her most was not so much putting the powder in Dragon's bowl, but the fear that at the last minute she might lose her nerve and bungle it somehow. That could wreck the plan. She looked toward the Fitzgibbons farm, and there, on the back porch lying in the sun, was Dragon. He was watching a pair of sparrows playing in the grass, halfway to the chicken yard. The tip of his tail barely twitched as he debated whether or not they were near enough to spring for. He looked very big and very dangerous. At least he wasn't looking in her direction, and Mrs. Frisby hurried on the bush directly to the hidden entrance and slipped inside. When she reached the arched portal, Brutus was standing guard as before, but this time he greeted her politely. "Ah, I've been expecting you," he said. "May I go in?" "If you'll wait just a minute, I'll get Justin." He went inside the arch and pressed a small button on the wall. Mrs. Frisby hadn't noticed it before. "Oh, a doorbell," she said. "It rings a buzzer down below. If I push it 3 times, you'd see some action." "Action?" "That's the alarm signal. A dozen rats would come out the door, ready to fight. All the rest, with the women and children, would be hurrying out the back door." "I didn't know there was a back door." "It comes out in the woods, in the blackberry bramble. It's got a long tunnel, longer than this one." When Justin appeared, they went down the same hallway as before, but this time, when they reached the chamber where the elevator and the stairway led down, Justin paused. "Nicodemus thought you might like to see our main hall. Just a quick look. He said you asked about the plan." "I did," said Mrs. Frisby, "but he didn't tell me about it." "Well, it's more than just a plan now, but we're used to calling it that. If you see the main hall, you'll get an idea of what we're doing." So instead of going down as they had before, Justin led the way across the chamber, where, as Mrs. Frisby had noticed, the tunnel continued. They walked along for what seemed like several more minutes. "Somewhere right around here," Justin remarked, "we're entering the woods. You'll notice the tunnel runs a bit crooked. We had to bend it to go around some roots, some as thick as fence posts." They went on until they came to a fork in the tunnel. "Right. Fork leads out to the blackberry bramble," said Justin. "Left fork leads to the main hall." They took the left fork. "Now brace yourself for a surprise." From ahead came noises, the sound of many rats talking, a sound of hurrying and thumping, and of machinery running. They stepped into a room as full of activity as a factory. It was the biggest room that Mrs. Frisby had ever seen, half the size of a house, with a ceiling and floor hard gray rock. It was brightly lit with electrical bulbs. Here, the large-sized ones, strung unshaded, and beneath them were rats at work everywhere. There was a steady procession to and from the far end of the chamber, and each of these rats wore a harness to which was fastened a pair of large, sturdy sacks, one on each side like a miniature pack horse. As the rats trooped in, their sacks were empty. They disappeared into a part of the room that was hidden by a high wall of wood. When they came out, the sacks were full and heavy. As she watched a troop of 10, their sacks bulging, they went past her out the tunnel. They greeted Justin and nodded at her, but they didn't pause. She noticed that just inside the entrance, an electrical fan whirred quietly. Mrs. Frisby stood beside Justin and gasped. She felt dizzy at the sight, the motion, the noise, and the size of the room, which must have measured 20 feet long and almost as wide. "How could you have dug out such a big room?" she asked. "We didn't," said Justin. "We found it. It's a natural cave. You can see that the ceiling and the floor are solid rock. That's the reason, or the main one, that we chose this spot to live. Others have lived here before us, probably for centuries before there was a farmhouse or bears. Then wolves and foxes, groundhogs. We had quite a cleaning job to do, I can tell you. But when we found it, there was a large hole, only a few feet long, leading straight in, but it was so full of sticks and leaves you could barely see it. We closed the entrance entirely and dug another, longer and narrower, our back door. Then we dug out the living quarters outside the rose bush and the entrance that you came in. But the cave is still our chief workshop. Let's go in." As they entered, some of the rats looked up, some waved and smiled, but all quickly turned back to the work they were doing. They're all on schedule, Justin explained, so they can't stop working. One group, especially busy, was gathering around an odd-shaped object of wood and metal about a foot long. It was curved and had a point at the other end. It looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, rather like the side of a small boat. Could the rats be making a boat? Then she saw that they were fastening a strong metal ring to the top of it. Justin led her to it. That, he said, is our most important invention, the key to the whole plan. We made a pilot model last fall. We tried it out and it worked. So now we're making 3 more. But what is it? It's a plow. Nicodemus designed it himself after reading every book he could find about farm tools. It's light and sharp, especially made to be pulled by rats. It takes 8 of us to pull it. More if the turf is tough, but what if we can turn over in a day of hard work a patch of earth about 10, 15 feet? But why? Why do you need it for? Come over here, I'll show you. He led the way to the back of the cave, where the high walls stood. He opened a door and beckoned through. She stood in a large wooden bin, staring at her feet, and rising in a slope to the wall of the cave was a small mountain of grain. Oats, said Justin. He led her on, opened another door to another mountain. Wheat, he said, and others. Barley, corn, soybeans. We've been building these stockpiles for a long time, all from Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm. We now have a 2-year supply for 108 rats, plus enough to plant for 2 crops in case the first one fails. And there, we have boxes full of seeds for tomatoes, beets, carrots, melons, and a lot more. All the time they stood there, the steady procession of rats continued. They entered the bins, took off their harness sacks, filled the sacks with grain, put them on again, and left through the tunnel, out the back door. They looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, like very large ants, endlessly toiling up an anthill. Justin must have gotten the same impression, for he said, If the ants can do it, Nicodemus says, if the bees can do it, so can we. Do what? We live without stealing, of course. That's the whole idea. That's the plan. And that's the end of chapter 20. Come back tomorrow, we'll read chapters 21 and 22 of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. Till then, I hope you enjoy this wonderful day outside. I hope you're all staying safe, staying healthy, and I'll see you tomorrow.